right. So restate your question.
My question is, what is your opinion on non-duality type of investigation, where you ask, for me, what works is I know I'm aware of thinking sometimes, not all the time. So when your question is, who or what is it that is aware of thinking? And you basically repeat that question to yourself. And intellectually, there is no answer really. But some things happen in meditation when you work with that.
Okay. Who who did you get that question from of who's doing the thinking? Did you get that from me or from a book or something?
Uh, no, I just, there is the typical ones like who am I or who hears. But when I go through what actually works for me, I try to think, okay, I know I'm thinking. I know sometimes I'm aware that I'm thinking. So the next step for me was, oh, who is it that's aware? So I kind of went step by step and came to a type of question that seems to work for me.
Okay. All right. Um, there are some forms of Buddhism and other therapies that do ask that question about who am I or what is it that's doing the thinking, and that generally the way that the questions are asked are kind of a wrong approach. All right. And so the Buddha has a particular sutta called the Sabbasava Sutta, which is actually sutta number 2. And in there, the taints are uh, arranged in an order that fits something like this. The taints that can be removed by directly seeing, the taints that can be removed by using, the taints that can be removed by avoiding. So some things you have to avoid, all right? And the things that would be things to avoid would be a thicket, a cesspool, a red light district, a war zone. Those kinds of things are to be avoided. But the taints to be removed by using would be like using adequate housing, adequate clothing, sufficient medicine, the kinds of things that we need. So there's a base floor. Psychologists, by the way, have understood this also for quite a long time. That and the way that they state it is that if you're at the poverty level, then there will be suffering and unhappiness. But if you come up above that poverty level, then a certain amount of suffering and unhappiness is eliminated. But above that, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you're still going to have that same basic level of suffering and unhappiness. But that when you go into real poverty, an example of that would be basic things like shoes. That a child who has no shoes is, let us say, limited in the distance that he can travel and therefore limited in the knowledge that he will ever gain. And so that's real poverty. Though shoes are not listed as one of the four requisites, you could actually put that in as adequate clothing. Because if someone doesn't have real adequate clothing, the signs of no shoes, no shirt, no service, etc., like that. So there are basic amounts that we have to have. Once we get up to that basic level, there is nothing about materialism that is going to satisfy us in any way at all. But the first part of the sutta are the taints that can be removed by seeing. And in this sutta, the Buddha draws a major distinction between what's worthy of paying attention to and what's not worthy paying attention to. And in that regard, paying attention to who was I in the past or what was I in the past is actually just the same as just reminiscing in the past. Because normally when we reminisce in the past, we do it with an identification. An example of that is something that happened before you were born, but you still identify it with it in one respect or another. Take World War II. Every nation that you live in, the people of that country will have a different opinion of World War II based upon their own identity. So it's very rare for an American to take the German point of view of World War II. All right. So, in that regard, any old past that we're into, we still identify with it in some way or another. It's me. Okay. What was I in the past? Who was I in the past? Or who was my team in the past, etc. The same thing is true in the future. What will I be? You probably heard the song Que Sera, Sera, whatever will be, right? When I was just a little girl, I asked my mother, what will I be? And the mother was very wise in this song, Que Sera, Sera. Who knows what you'll be? Now, this also applies to the present moment. Who am I? What am I right now? The Buddha also considers that is inappropriate attention. But the question that you're asking is a valid question, but you're asking it in a way of reference that is inappropriate way of looking at it. And so we need a better way or a better approach. So what is it that's worthy then of us paying attention to if the past and the future and who am I and all of that is not appropriate? Then the correct or appropriate way of looking at it would be through the position of the Four Noble Truths of this is suffering. This is the cause of suffering. This is what it's like to be free from suffering. And we all need to spend a bit of time reminiscing or trying to figure out what it's like to actually be free from suffering. Because if we can figure out what it's like to be free from suffering, then we'll know how to apply the path that takes us to a basic state when we're free from suffering almost all the time. And that when we go into suffering, we can come right back out of it really quickly. So, basically, the question that you're asking is a correct question, but it's got the wrong frame of reference. And the way that I want to change the frame of reference is to look at the second noble truth. Because the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is in fact what you're looking at, in the sense that the cause of suffering is this selfishness. All right, so basically the cause of suffering is lobha, moha, dosa, or greed, ill will, and delusion. The Four Noble Truths are basically everything that the Buddha taught. Everything that the Buddha taught. In fact, in Sutta number 22, in the simile of the snake, he says that both formerly and now, currently, I teach only one thing, and that is dukkha, dukkha nirodha. That's the only thing that he teaches. So in that regard, who am I is not really appropriate until we dig down in to actually identify what the problem is. But on the surface level, basically, the cause of suffering is that people do not take responsibility for themselves. That if you look at the second noble truth in a particular way, you can see, oh, it's not general ignorance that causes suffering. It's not general ill will. It's not general greed. It's most specifically that when I've got greed, that I suffer. When I've got ill will, I suffer. When I've got ignorance, I'm suffering. So it's really kind of localized in that way. and that it teaches us to take on responsibility for ourselves. In that regard, now we're looking at it from modern psychology perspective of the concept of underdog or top dog, if you're looking at Fritz Perls, or with Eric Berne, I'm okay, you're okay versus I'm not okay. More modern terms, we use the word victim because we all feel like that we're victims in the beginning of life. Well, the second noble truth says, oh no, if there is any victimization, it's you that's victimizing you. You're both sides of that argument. All right? That we're actually creating our own misery, our own suffering. So when we step down into the next level down, which I think that we talked last time about the five aggregates and Paticca Samuppada, basically that's where we want to go with the question that you're asking is right back down to that level of what is the source of self and how is it as it's being created. It's created with a purpose, and that purpose is to be the recipient of the suffering. That when there is no one to suffer, then there is no suffering. Um, a really silly example that a farm boy, died in the field, and there his body lays, no suffering. But when his mom comes and finds the body, now she's in a great deal of suffering. But she created that suffering because when she was in the house and the boy was dead in the field, she didn't know it. So the death of the boy did not cause her suffering. Isn't that interesting? The death of the boy did not cause her suffering. She caused her own suffering due to her attachment and her love and her loss and all of that. So when we recognize that this second noble truth, or the way that the Buddha is pointing to, is that we've got to turn everything around. Everything is upside down because we're looking at it. In fact, even the way that you're asking the question is coming from the opposite approach to what's really going on. All right, because this woman is going to be asking, why did my son die, without asking the right question of, why do I feel so bad about it? Because things happen. People die. But and not only that, but a whole lot of suffering comes, and you know this for sure, without having your son die or your brother die. There's all kinds of suffering that we can be engaged with. So what we need to do is kind of revisit this Paticca Samuppada, or this series of events, because that sequence of events, or the series of events, are in fact who you are. But and I'll even take the word event out and resubstitute the word process. That the human being is a series of mental processes. And when those processes are wise, we wind up not in suffering. And when those mental processes are not wise, we wind up in suffering, but we also wind up with a self that suffers. That this is an important point, that perhaps we can think of it like this, that the self that you're talking about is temporary and does not exist normally. It only exists at certain points of time, but when it does exist, it seems so big and so powerful that it looks like that it's there all the time. All right. Let me give you a silly example. The silly example is there's a cave that's got two holes or two entrances, one on this side of the mountain, and then down further, there's another hole. We see the bear go into the cave. And so we stand outside of that hole that the bear went in, waiting for that bear. He's very dangerous, and so we stand there, and the bear's not in the cave at all. There's nobody there. He went out the other hole. But we think the bear is still in the cave. All right? That's exactly the way that the self is. So you're waiting around at a hole for the self to come out, and the self's not even in that hole. He's gone. That's an important quality. The self is not there all the time. It's temporary. It arises temporary and passes away temporary. In fact, it's only there when there's some kind of clinging going on. And that we know that the four modes of clinging are, in fact, part of the four primary instincts. So, another way of looking at it is the self arises when when the basic instincts are in operation. And when the basic instincts are not in operation, in fact, when you're in higher mind, when you're in the human mental world, then the instincts are at bay. And in that regard, there's no self. So if you look at that instinct of the self-preservation instinct, and by the way, the scientists who figured all of this stuff out were not Buddhas. And because of that, they made a basic mistake, calling it the self-preservation instinct. They're making the same mistake that is inherent in the question that you were asking. It's not a self-preservation instinct, it's an organism preservation instinct, and it's instinctual. There is something deep in the mind, deep in the DNA. It's deep, in fact, buried in the anterior cortex of the brain that is self-protecting. The whole point of that mechanism is to keep the human alive, to keep it breathing, to keep the heart beating, to keep all this stuff going, to make sure that the muscles are working so that we can reach and grab and all of that kind of stuff. That's very basic inside of the brain. So that we kind of get the idea that this self-preservation instinct is there all the time, when in fact it only comes up when it seems to be necessary. A clear example of that is the 14-year-old boy who's just trotting down the hall at school, and around the corner comes the bully and his two friends. All right? Now, I call the guy the bully because that's how the 14-year-old sees it. He sees this guy as a bully, and he feels afraid. In fact, he might even freeze with fear, which then gives the bully a complete opportunity to take over and overpower this 14-year-old, because he was under the delusion that this was a dangerous situation. Normally, schools, even with bullies, are not dangerous. The bully's job is to make it appear to be dangerous when it's really not. That if that 14-year-old will stand up to the bully, say, aha, here with your two friends, I bet if you were alone, you wouldn't act like such a stupid person, and sort of divide and conquer and challenge him, then in that regard, the bully's bully part will start to disappear, because the bully requires the victim to be playing the role of victim. If the victim doesn't play the role of victim, then the bully's role doesn't work either. All right. So this is a clear example of before the bully rounded the corner, the boy was not in that state. He might have been thinking about what he's going to do in the afternoon or anything like that, but he was not in a state of terror. But as soon as he saw the bully rounding the corner, that's when the panic sets in. That's when the self-protecting mechanism came into play, and it came into play ignorantly. So that's in fact how the self comes. The self comes through ignorance. It comes through feelings. In fact, if we back up to the second noble truth again, we recognize that all the Buddha is actually pointing at three different kinds of feelings here. That ignorance is actually a kind of feeling. And so the greed, let us say this, that once something gets up to the level of greed, it's kind of an inflated feeling. That the feelings start at very small, but they grow very quickly. And when I say very quickly, we're talking about maybe within a second or 2 seconds. And the Buddha talks about it like this in the sense that the mind is fast. Oh, monk, the mind is so fast, I don't even have an analogy for how fast the mind is. And an easy example of that is you've heard of the planet Saturn. You know exactly what the planet Saturn looks like. And yet you also know enough about celestial mechanics to understand that it sometimes Saturn is very, very far away because the Earth is also on the other side of the sun, and sometimes it's a whole lot closer to Saturn. But even if its closest point, it's still about an hour away as far as light, the speed of light. Well, you just went to Saturn just a moment ago and came back. That's how fast the mind is. It's much faster than the speed of light when you're thinking about a particular kind of territorial distance, because the speed of light gets in fact slower and slower and slower, to where the mind is always very fast. It happens very, very quickly. So that means that these feelings are basic. They start out at the basic point of I like it, or it starts out at the basic point I don't like it, or it starts out at the basic place of I'm not sure whether I like it or not. I'm confused. Okay, so this feeling that can be called a confused feeling gives rise then to doubt, uncertainty, perplexity, unsurety, almost to the point of freezing. That in because of our old nature from ancient times, there were a large number of predators don't have good eyesight. And because of that, all they can see is motion, and they'll chase motion. In fact, you can see that with cats. If you've got a kitty or a cat, I know you've got a dog, so you probably don't have a cat, but cats are very much like that. That they get enamored with moving objects, so that they'll chase lasers or they'll chase a ball all over the floor or whatever. It's that movement, all right? So, a biological mechanism as a preventing from that is the freeze state. If we can freeze, then the cat can't see us. And so that freeze will actually take over. You've actually experienced that in your life, even without lions and tigers and cats. You know what that's like. Is that something happens and you freeze, you just stop. All right, that is part of the basic feeling. Now, if these feelings are wise, in other words, if we know what we feel, for instance, if we see something and we like it, and we know that we see something and we like it, then that's a point of wisdom. If we don't like something and we see immediately that this is just a feeling of not liking, or if the feeling arises of confusion, or I'm not sure whether I like it or not, and you know that feeling, then this is a wise feeling. In that regard, you have a major choice about how you're going to respond to the way that you feel, because you know how you feel, especially if you haven't reacted yet or that you're still in a state of freeze. So, freeze goes before flight or fright. So, we'll either fight or we'll flee. And in that regard, there are already chemicals being pumped in the body to prepare us for that. So the first thing that happens with the reptilian brain, the anterior cortex, is that it sends signals to freeze, to stop. The next thing it does is it starts pumping a lot of adrenaline and perhaps cortisol also to get into the bloodstream to get us ready to either flight or fright. Well, in our Western society, fight and flight is generally not an option. Going back to the 14-year-old and the bully, the 14-year-old chose to freeze, but now his body is full of all of these chemicals getting him ready to fight and flight, and he's not going to do either one. So these chemicals are now in the body in an inappropriate way, because at least the frontal cortex is smart enough to say you don't have to fight the bully. Don't pull out a knife and jab him. He's just being a bully. All right. So in this way, we have to start dealing with these feelings as early as they can, because they will explode or grow very quickly into emotions. So the feeling I like it will grow into I want it. And I want it will grow into I've got to have it, which then will cause plotting and planning and wanting to get a hold of it and whatever like that. That also is the process of the birth of the self. It's I got to have it, or the actual cleaning. So the way that it looks like, if you can use my arms, is that there is a feeling here, and if the feeling is a feeling I want it, then there's going to be grasping to it. This is the wanting, the drawing towards it. Grabbing hold of it then is the clinging. Now I've got it. Now, this is the state where most of the teachers will talk about let go. This is where the whole concept of letting go comes from, is because we've already created a self to do the attachment, the grabbing hold. The grabbing requires a grabber. Clinging requires a clingor. That's the birth of the self. If there's no clinging, there's no clinger. So that's how the mind creates. But once we start the clinging, once we recognize that's mine, then we do that with the concept of this mine or meanness must be a reality. It must be existential, and in fact, it must be kind of permanent. Where in fact, it wasn't. It hadn't been there for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, but as soon as the boy rounds the corner, as soon as he sees the bully, bang, now the clinging is there. This is me. This is dangerous. Okay? So, looking at it from the position of who am I is going to be difficult, because this self is actually quite intermittent. And it only comes up when we're suffering. So it's best not to try to investigate the self and who am I, because in order to do that, you've got to be in a state of suffering. If you're not in a state of suffering, then there's no self to investigate. What's the point?
What about the question I was working with? What is being aware?
All right. Let us say that being aware is a process, that it doesn't require a being to be aware. In that regard, it's just awareness. It's a function of the human mind, but it's not you who is aware.
So in that questioning, you kind of, intellectually think the same way, maybe there is no me, let's just look what awareness is. Is that skillful, or?
Well, yes, it is. In fact, what you want to look at here is the fact that there are two kinds of consciousnesses, and you can be aware of either one of them, or we can focus on one or the other so that you can understand them. The first kind of consciousness, as we talked before, is basic consciousness that's associated with the senses, so that you have the consciousness of seeing, you have the consciousness of hearing, you have the consciousness of touch. But that consciousness of touch, by the way, is extraordinarily complex, much more complex than seeing. A lot of people think that the most complex organ we have is our sight, But in fact, it's the human body that is the most complex. An example of that is your eyes cannot normally detect cold or heat, but the body can. The eyes cannot do a whole lot of stuff, but the other sense organs can. And that's why we have all of these 5 or 6 sense organs, is because we have that sensory awareness. And when we do have sensory awareness, that's what we're talking about. Now, there's another kind of awareness, another kind of consciousness, and that is an internal kind. And we actually use the word seeing in both ways. So I can see in the sense of using my eyes, I see what's coming, or we can use the word seeing in reference to I see what you mean. It's a different or a deeper understanding. It's a mental process. This mental process in the Pali is called salayatana, and the difference is that the organs, the sense organs themselves in Pali are called the atana, and so the salayatana is the internal representation. Just as I was telling you last time, that the boy goes into 7-Eleven and he sees the girl and then he comes back and he's thinking about her, that's the salayatana, that's the inside. And that's what he's concentrating on, that's what he's aware of. And in fact, he's so aware of the salayatana that he's not aware of where that salayatana came from. Because the boy now is falling in love with his image of a girl and not the real girl herself. That the real girl is quite complicated. She's a human being with all of the warts and freckles and ingrown hairs and perhaps a history with children and 2 ex-husbands and all kinds of stuff. And perhaps a mother who hates every boyfriend that she's ever had, hence 2 ex-husbands. But the young man doesn't have any of that. He does not have the reality. He only has his salayatana, the internal representation. So in that regard, there's a huge amount of actual real ignorance built into that, because we think we understand, because we've seen it, we think we know it, or we've named it, we think we know it, and in fact, we don't at all. Because all we know is that internal representation, that salayatana. So, going back to your question of who or what is awareness, the answer is that the mind being referential the way that it is, you could begin to actually, by studying or by watching what's going on, by being very, very quick and understanding as feelings arise, you can begin to see those feelings. You can begin to back up then into the salayatana, begin to back up into perception, so that you can get back down to basic consciousness, the actual just seeing that's associated with the sense organ. When we can do that, then things look like that we're overwhelmed with the flood of all of the sensual input that's coming in. Because normally what we do, we would become overwhelmed with it. And so as children, we begin to select out things. We begin to cut pathways and say, okay, that daddy gets through, this doesn't. This is going to be ignored. So that's what we mean by perception, in the sense that when we're looking, when our eyes are open, we will take an object. We will take that object and perceive that object using all of our sankaras and all of our old memory base and whatever like that to come up with an internal representation, the salayatana. That salayatana will then contact us. It makes contact with so the mind is now seeing something. He's not actually going to react to what happened on the outside, what he saw. He's going to react to his understanding of it on the inside. And that contact is what gives rise to feelings. So Bhikkhu Buddhadasa recommends to stay alert in the beginning, at least, to this point of contact, so that when things contact us, the feelings arise. Now, this is actually quite a lot of work to do, but let us say that this being Johnny on the spot with this can be there about 1 second. If you go down to about a half a second, now you can go down to the level of actual um, uh, consciousness and no longer waste that half second of perception. But normally, what happens is that they go through the consciousness, through perception, into salayatana, into the internal representation. From that, they have the feeling from or the contact and the feeling, but they're still not awake. They're still not aware of what's going on, and so that ignorant feeling will then go into grasping and clinging. The grasping and clinging then requires a graspor and a clingor, and that's where the self comes from. And not only that, but you could also think of it as a bucket or a vessel for suffering. If there is no self, then there is nothing to be the object of the suffering. And that's something that a lot of people, they don't understand. They recognize, oh, well, I thought that I was. No, you're not always. That it may be so much so that you're only of a self about 10 minutes a day, but those are the 10 minutes of the most painful part of the day. The rest of the day, no pain because there's no self. But we still have the delusion that there's a self there all the time. Because when it does arise, it really makes itself known. It's really present. This hurts. Ouch. This is me. This is mine. And so this is another way of looking at it, or a way of approaching it, is to recognize that the human mind is a process. That in fact is very similar to computers, or especially unit record machines before computers, where you had a card that would go in, there would be some processing, and then there would be an old printer that would go ka-chunga. And then it would have another card cycle and read in a card. Then it would do some processing, and then it would print the next line, ka-chunga. Well, that's basically what the human being is doing. We see something on the outside, we process it, and then we get our result. Now, if we process something to the point of the feeling that's ignorant, that's like the machine having, let us say, a sticky relay, or a cog that doesn't turn exactly right. So when that kachanga, that printing is there, there'll be one character on that line that's the wrong character. Okay, so that's the suffering. And if the machine is really broken, when that card feeds in, a whole lot of mistakes are made, and then the kachanga comes up, and now the whole line, you can't even read it. You don't even know what it is. All right, so this is a way of looking at the mind, is like that old accounting machine, that you take sensory input, we process it, and then we come up with a result. If there is, let's say, a broken wire or something that we miss or whatever like that, the place that happens is at the place of feeling. Now, with the human being, mostly it's not really a broken wire. Normally, it's just an old bad habit that we process things wrongly. That in fact, much of the concept of the self comes not from the child itself, or himself or herself. It comes from the way that the family and the society treats the self, because everyone in his family is under the delusion that there is a self. And so we pass that delusion from one generation to the next. The idea that there is a self in there, to where in fact there is not a self, there is only a process. Now, if I can go off into another kind of an area for you, the idea of the self being temporary, is an anathema to many people, because not only do we have the idea that there is a self all the time that comes from society, but now we'll have some religions or some groups that says this self is permanent. It's long lasting. It's going to be there right off into the future. Even when the body dies, there's still going to be this self that still exists. In Hinduism, they consider that self directly as being consciousness itself. So, where within Christianity, what it is tends to not get well defined, and or what it is changes over time. And what I'm getting at, imagine this. Imagine that you went and visited heaven and that you saw people in heaven. All right. What is it that you're actually seeing? An ephemeral body? Do they have eyes? Do they have ears? Are they walking around in white or golden robes or whatever? Or are they just unfocused, let us say, light orbs floating in the air? All right, so the whole idea about heaven is that all the physical body, the human body with eyes and all of that is in, and so the Christian concept is much more of the body. This is why the history of burial, and in fact, the Muslims get really, really uptight about it. That if they think that they lose a body part here on earth, that they'll miss that body part in heaven. That's why it's so common for beheadings or mutilation of genitalia for the enemies in Islam, because they can't collect all their body back together for the afterlife. Within Hinduism, though, the body is really not important at all. That's why it's okay to cremate. But there is something. Now, the idea is that it is consciousness. Consciousness itself is what's reborn, but the Buddha was very, very particular in Sutta number 38 to point out that, oh no, consciousness is dependently arisen. It arises dependent upon something. The example is that consciousness depends upon the eye and the object that the eye sees. If there is no object, then, and just an eye, like the eyes are closed, then there is no consciousness. But if you open your eyes and see that someone has come into the room, then you become conscious of that someone has come in because you can see them. All right. So this is consciousness. The Buddha talks about it in the sense of fire. That all the kinds of fire that we know has a name that's named by its fuel. For instance, a grass fire, or a gas fire, or a wood fire, or a house fire, or a car fire. All right, so consciousness is also known by its source, the fuel. So the fuel for sight would be the eye. So eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, and these are all temporary. That in fact you have no consciousness when you're asleep. Waking up is in fact bringing consciousness back online. So this basic consciousness requires, for instance, sight requires an eye. Now I know that we have satellites, but in the old days, the idea was that how can God watch everything we're doing if he's up in the sky? There's no eye in the sky. Now we have satellites, so yeah, we've got eyes. But those eyes are really high and they don't have the detail. But the point is that if in heaven the body is an ephemeral body and is not really real, then there are not really real eyes that can really see. The problem is the issue of consciousness. How can we have consciousness if there is no body? And so this is a basic issue of Christianity and Islam and all of the religions about what is it that can be reborn. to where with the Buddha, we understand that there is not going to be anything reborn after the human body dies, but there is a different kind of birth. And that birth is the birth of the self. And the birth of the self is the clinging. So when we talk about letting go, what we're actually talking about is letting go of the self that's doing the clinging, to drop it all. But that's pretty late in the game. The Buddha and the Bhikkhu Buddhadasa recommends let's go back all the way to feeling before we start clinging. Okay, so an example of that would be being in an argument with your husband, and he says yak 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 yak, and he says yak 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 yak, and she says yak 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 yak, etc., like that, and then one of them wakes up, one of them sees what's going on, and so the right thing to do is to shut the mouth, to be quiet. Don't talk right now. Why? Because we're full of emotion. Both of us are fully into grasping and clinging and hanging on, and you do it my way. No, you do it my way, etc. But when we can close our mouth, now we can come back and start doing a little bit of anapanasati. Let me take a deep breath. Let me calm down. Let me expect the fact and recognize and see for sure that I am in fact angry. Because most people deny their anger. The ill will is delusional. You can, in fact, it's actually quite easy to see, but the scene would be that two guys are arguing, let us say, in a bar, and a third guy comes up and says, why don't you take this outside, and they'll listen to that. But if you say, why are you so angry? They'll both say, I'm not angry. I'm not angry. The problem is not me. The problem is him. And so this is how anger works because it's so ignorant. And so waking up in it. And everyone eventually does wake up in the anger. Some third party will come in, or perhaps the husband will recognize that he's gone too far, he said the wrong thing, and now he slams the door and walks out. Why does he do that? Because he recognizes that this has gone too far. This is not what we want to do. Let's stop this, okay? And in fact, if no one ever wakes up, you're going to have a body that needs to be buried or put in the lake or something. Eventually, they wake up. Eventually, they say, this is enough. Your job now is to say, I'm going to say enough sooner and sooner and sooner into the process. You going to work, huh? Okay. Oh, see you. Bye-bye. Tam's going to work, so I say goodbye.
Yeah.
So this I hope is giving you the kind of answer that's useful to you. To not look for a self directly, because you're going to wind up in suffering if you do. What you need to do is look at the process in the mind that generates the self. Because by doing that, you can stop it before it gets too far. Now, I give you a really clear example, and this example is from Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Sumedho. And it happened many, many years ago, but it happened in such a way that it made it quite remarkable. Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Sumedho, I don't think he was an Ajahn at that time, he was still a student monk. And they were both at a Katen ceremony, which meant there were a lot of lay people, and that this is also the ceremony where the young girls will come to the temple with their mothers, husband shopping for a husband who is about to disrobe. And so they're all dolled up, all dressed up, everything like that. So that's the scene. And so Ajahn Chah turns to Ajahn Sumedho and says, "What do you think about this?" And Ajahn Sumedho gave a really excellent example of the understanding of Paticca Samuppada in brief by saying these little words: I like, but I don't want. That's the place that we need to start looking for, is can you come to that state to where you know how you feel about something and that you can stop it at that. I like it, but I don't want it. Or I don't like it, but I don't have to trash it. Or the third kind of feeling is I don't know whether I like it or not, and that's okay. Let's do some more examination. Because if we are doing these kinds of feelings ignorantly, they will eventually, very quickly, within 3-4 seconds, into bad feelings. Confusion leads to fear. Ill will leads to anger. Liking leads to greed, which means we may, in fact, hurt someone to get what we want. So, lobha, moha, dosa, the three qualities of the second noble truth, also wind up being the very basic feelings that we have. But the suffering is because of the process that we're going through. So the question of who am I, the actual best answer we can give is I am a human processing. I'm in the process of humaning. And that's about the best that we can come to, is that I'm a process. Now, I think I mentioned to you the idea of going into a chemistry lab and finding a beaker of acid. Yeah, okay. And when you recognize that every cell of the body is like that little beaker of acid. In fact, there's a lot of acid in the body. We're mostly acidic. That's why we take an antacid when we've got the tummy ache. And there's many, many kinds of acids. DNA. The A of DNA is the word acid. Did you know that? Our DNA is an acid. We also have amino acids. We have protein is built on an acid. Proteins are in fact an acid plus another molecule or two or whatever like that. I'm not a chemist or a biochemist, but I do know enough to recognize that the whole body operates the way that it does, in a unison the way that it does, that gives us the delusion that there is a boss, a me in there, when in fact it's not. It's a cooperation. It's sort of like a city without a mayor. And many cities can operate quite finely with a mayor, and in fact, the cities that have a mayor wind up having more trouble because of someone in there messing with the system, wanting to take his own advantage out of it. But when you have everybody just cooperating together in a village without anybody in particular who's the boss, then the village can function fine. And nobody even thought about having a village manager. So that's where the human being is, that there's no boss in there. There is no me there. Especially not a permanent me. Especially not a physical permanent me. So the Hindus think that it's consciousness that's being reborn. The Christians and the Muslims have a kind of a quality that is an ephemeral body, but it's a self that I look the same. Here's a question for you. When the old man dies and goes to heaven, when he's in heaven, does he look like the old man that he was when he died? Or does he look like when he's 15? Or does he look like he's 35? Does he have a choice? Or does God make him look like the old man that died? The answer to that is all mental processing. This is what we're making up these images without even thinking about what's really going on. What's really going on is that you're merely a process, and that you have choices over how that process is going to operate. So the best thing for you to do then with your meditation is begin, let us say, once the mind is stable enough. And when I'm saying stable, we've talked about the ability to read, that you read a book, you start to read, and you can read down to the bottom of the page, and when you get to the bottom of the page, you know that you've gotten everything off of that page, that the mind hasn't just wandered away someplace. Well, that's what happens when we're looking at the way that the mind works. It's very easy to get sidetracked. But never mind, we come back and we start again, and we start understanding, oh, there is a difference between seeing with the eyes and the processing that comes to giving me an internal representation of that. The word in Pali, by the way, for this perceptual system is called Namarupa. Nama means naming or labeling or identifying or, in a way, mental ownership. But Rupa is the actual real object that's on the outside. So, the naming is the internal representation of the object. When you recognize that you're doing that, now you're beginning to understand what perception is, because we actually react to the internal representation, not the external representation. Here's another example of that, is just a little itch. The little itch, and in fact, itches are really, really good teachers. Normally, we ignore them completely. Little body sensations, but by ignoring them, what that means is the reptilian mind is not ignoring it. The reptilian mind is right on it. But your body and your hands and that place that itch are all connected to the brain through the brain stem into the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain deals with all of the sensory input very quickly. Star athletes who can perform things, or martial artists that can do brilliant things. What they've actually been training is this reptilian mind, because the reptilian mind is that which is very fast. If you think about it like this, imagine that we're in some sort of primordial swamp to where there's alligators and snakes and all kinds of things in there, and it's a dangerous position to be in. And so every animal that's in that primordial swamp has to be on high alert and is capable of seeing things and reacting to it very quickly. So that's how the brain works. So that itch that we have is going to be known by the reptilian brain, whether or not the human part of the brain even knows about it or not. And so the reptilian part of the brain will actually use the hands, because the reptilian brain controls the hands, and do the scratching. And here we are doing this kind of stuff ignorantly, tearing the flesh, pulling great big hunks out with our fingernails, because we don't like the situation, or we don't like the sensation, but we're also ignorant about not liking it, letting the reptilian brain do things on automatic pilot. And so the job of the meditator is to come out of automatic pilot, not allow the body to, or the hands to scratch itches. So let's look at the itch as an itch, rather than having to deal with it as something that we've got to get rid of. All right. By doing that, now we're beginning to say, I'm actually going to perceive this itch and look at it, and to recognize that what I don't like is not the itch itself that's on the outside of the body, over here or whatever. The not liking is mental. The itch is just an itch. The bodily sensations are just bodily sensations. We call them pains because we've mentalized it to the point of not liking it. And so we don't like it. So when Samuppada says, I like it, he's talking about all the pretty girls, but I don't want it, which means he's being able to stop it right there. He does not have to fantasize. He does not have to plan. He does not have to do anything. He's able to cut that off right at that point of feelings. This is what the Buddha and Bhikkhu Buddhadasa recommends as, let us call it an intermediate place, because the beginner, we have to get our minds focused so that we can actually watch this process. As you know, it's going to happen very fast. This stuff goes, and we're already into suffering. And so we have to start looking at it, breaking it down, checking it out, and the further into the, let us say, backwardsly speaking, the further in we go, which means the earlier into the process that we go, we can actually get down to the point of mere consciousness without perception, which means that at mere consciousness, we're not taking any object at all. There's no object being taken, which means that the sensory input that we, something happens, we take it, we process it, we have a feeling about it, we want it, all of that kind of stuff that happens for seconds. If we stop doing that, then that means that much more is going to contact us from the outside world. That the world is, in fact, a very, very busy place every second. So the concept of the stream enterer means that we're going to enter that stream of reality, but others of us call it a river. Some of us call it a flood because there's so much happening.
Does it feel overwhelming?
No, because overwhelming is a perception. That means that, in fact, the whatever that you've perceived as overwhelming, now you're paying attention to be overwhelmed rather than just being in the flood. So you're actually judging it. All right, so yes, you can feel overwhelmed, but that means that you've kind of lost what caused the overwhelmingness, and now we're in the process of feeling overwhelmed rather than in the process of being in the flood. Because the flood itself is not overwhelming. Overwhelming is a is a reaction. So we want to pay attention to this second noble truth because it breaks down into these 5 aggregates, none of which are you. That the you, or who am I, comes later in the process after these 5 aggregates have done their job. And feeling has arisen. Once feeling arises, now that's when the self will arise, but only if the feelings are ignorant. And the better you are at figuring out what your feelings are, the better you're able to control them. So that in one particular situation, let us say, because with me it's going to be my daughter. I've got a 6-year-old, and 6-year-olds do not behave, or even 5-year-olds do not behave the way that adults are expected to behave, and so she's going to be a child. And one of the things that she does, she still has a demand for wanting her way. Okay, she's very much into that ego boundary, and though we're working really well with her, I'm looking back at the time when she would get angry, frustrated, causing a tantrum, becoming angry, etc., like that. Now, every mother who has a child throwing a tantrum does not want her child throwing a tantrum because the mother is equating that child with me. I should not be throwing a tantrum right now. Shut your mouth. And so basically what happens is while the child is having a tantrum, mom is also having her own tantrum. And that this is when the mom will threaten violence. And if she threatens violence, now the child has two troubles. Now she's got both fear and greed going on. All right. But if we can find a way when mom comes in and sees that the child is throwing a tantrum, and the mom recognizes, I don't like that tantrum, now wise mom can choose a different method of behaving with the child. I do not have to be angry back because the child is angry. I can come back with compassion. I can come back with joy. I can come back with teasing. I can come back with an education for this child rather than coming back to this child with my own tantrum. Because, in fact, if the mom is throwing her own tantrum, then she's actually teaching the child that, look, I can control mom with tantrums. Not only that, but look, mom's tantrum is okay. My tantrums must be okay too. And so we wind up throwing tantrums for our whole life rather than having them interrupted by a wise mom, because mom throws her tantrums too. So you can use this example throughout your life in every case. But you don't have to apply. You can apply it to the dog. You can apply it to your husband. You can apply it to street traffic. You can apply it to a meal that you got at a restaurant that you don't like. You don't have to blame the restaurant. In fact, when we were in Bangkok last year, in December, just a month ago, 2 months ago now, I saw an Ethiopian restaurant. And I said, oh, I would like to go there because I remember a really good Ethiopian restaurant in Washington, D.C. Haven't had Ethiopian food in 25 years or so. Let's go do Ethiopian. Well, when we got there, we took the what they would call the standard meal, which is also vegetarian. You know, the Ethiopian has a layer of bread, or a very thin bread, and then they put the food around it on top of whatever. Well, Kitty wanted to play her cell phone at that moment. She was playing a game, so I watched her game and played the game with her a little bit. And Tam, I don't know. I think that Tam was really hungry because she had already been to 7-Eleven, but I was waiting for the Ethiopian. So I was the only one who was eating that food. And I was very happy with the owner of the restaurant and the waitress. It was one person. She was running the show, and I had really, really good conversation, and we talked about this food, and I like it that you put that in it. And then when we get home, Tam and I are having a conversation. I said, well, I didn't particularly like the food. And she said, well, you were giving all of this praise to the owner. I said, yes. If I had told that owner that I didn't like her food, she would have felt bad, and then that would have affected the next customer in the place. That my job is not to complain about the food. My job is to be a good customer for this lady. Okay, so that's another example of it. Just because I don't like her food doesn't mean that I have to feel bad. I can catch that and then deal with it at a more appropriate level. That's what the teaching of the Buddha, in a nutshell, is all about. If we can catch those feelings when they first arise, then we can choose how we're going to respond. But if the feeling is not wise feeling, in other words, there's no wisdom at the point of contact, then the ignorant way that we've always done, the old habits will take over, carrying us right into the suffering that we've always experienced when we have a state of not liking. Not liking almost always will go to suffering unless we're wise enough to put an end to it. The question is, how quick can we catch it? If we're really quick, then we can put an end to it before it ever grows into, I don't want to eat this. I can just leave it at the, I don't like the taste of this, but I'm going to eat it anyway.
Couple of times this week, I was able to catch myself, so I'm very happy about that. And even though when it went into more of the emotion of, I hate this, I want to prevent it at any cost, I was able to observe myself doing this emotion and be like, okay, like just wait, don't react yet, see what happens.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent.
So when a person does have that ability of just seeing, just hearing, so the stream entry happens, as they say, what would they work on afterwards?
There comes a time when it's not work anymore. There comes a time in the beginning, and for quite a while, I would go so far as the beginning and the middle, there is such a thing as right effort. But the right effort, when it becomes skillful, turns in more into an energy. It's almost like in the beginning, seeing the mind in suffering, we don't like it. So we actually do a little bit more suffering. But eventually, when we see suffering in the mind, we become repelled or repulsed by it. So in the beginning, when we contact suffering, we say, oh, well, that's me, or that's my way of doing it. But later, once we begin to see truly the nature of suffering and how it's created and et cetera like that, then merely touching it and we immediately draw back. Just as a tender infant, the analogy that the Buddha uses is just as a tender infant, if they put their hand or foot on a hot coal, the tender infant, the little baby, now we're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days old, that baby will immediately withdraw their hand from that hot coal. Doesn't take any effort at all on the baby's part. But there is a repulsion from that hot coal. That will be what happens eventually, so that it's no longer a great deal of effort to come out of suffering. Once we get really attuned to it, we repel from it. We become it becomes its own kind of energy. And so in the beginning, we have to kind of pull or draw ourselves out of the suffering. But once we get really attuned to the suffering, just touching it, and all of a sudden it just will bang. I don't want that. I want out of this. And so that's when we really start becoming dedicated to the path. We want to eliminate suffering. We want to be out of it. We want to recognize it. We want to be on the hunt for it so that we can avoid it very successfully. This is a major point along the line, but it only happens once we really understand the nature of the mind and the nature of suffering and how it's created through this process the Buddha calls Paticca Samuppada, which has the 5 aggregates at its base, plus these sequence of events, or they're not really events, they're processes. This sequence of process, one after another after another. In fact, you can think of it even with the dominoes, that the falling domino, the falling, is not an event, it's a process. The domino is upright, something ticks it, now it's in this position, now it's in this position, now the gravity is pulling it, now it touches the next domino, and now it's falling down. So that domino was not, in fact, an event. It didn't fall as an event. It wasn't bang and it happened. No, it was a process. So that's the way of looking at everything that happens is a process, not an event. And yet our whole language makes us look at things as an event. An example of that would be an automobile accident. We think of that as an event. The cops come out and they do their investigation and all of that. But that automobile accident was not an event, it was an entire process that happened that could have started with someone reaching for a sandwich or someone looking around saying, "Kids, shut up," or whatever like that. And that process, that sequence of events, one after another, and in fact, it wasn't a sequence of events. See, I'm making that mistake too. It's a sequence of processes that happened that wound up causing the automobile accident. But even in the accident itself, the accident was a process. As the metal hits the metal and the caving, etc., like that, that happens is all process oriented. So we have to begin to think of things as not events, but everything is a process. An example of that would be that the student is sitting in meditation, perhaps they're at a Goenka retreat, and they're holding their hands and their eyes and their legs still, and an itch comes up on the shoulder. So the Goenka method says, well, take a look at the itch. We recognize by looking that it's not one particular place. It's not an event. That itch is not an event. That itch is a process. And the more we look at it, in fact, we begin to start to chase it. When we first look at it, we say, "Oh, it hurts. It itches from here to here." But when I look there, it's not there. I have to look down there, not there. Okay, I draw back from it. Now the itch is there, but when I'm looking at it closely, I can't find it because it's a process. It's not an event. This is a major way of changing your style of thinking. That you're not an event, you're not a self, you're a process, you're a human process. And yet, because of the way our language is built on verbs and nouns. The language that we should use is all verbs, no nouns. Because you're not a noun. You're a process. You're a verb. Even the word being is problematic because the word being is actually a verb from the verb to be, but we've turned it into a noun. I think they call that a gerund or something like that. So being is a process. But when we use it in the terms of human beings, now we're talking about an event. Now we're talking about an individual, etc., like that. So our whole language, the English language, works against us because the language itself does not describe what's really going on. But your job is to figure out what's going on by watching closely, by having a mind that's sharp, focused, and when a thought arises, you can say, where did that thought come from? Now, here's another point about that, which is really quite remarkable, and that is most people become attached to their thoughts. They think my thoughts are my thoughts, and therefore, because I'm good, my thoughts are good. And so we identify with thinking, where in fact, thoughts are just a process in the brain. They're not you. And then, in fact, thoughts themselves, there's no guarantee that a thought is going to be a worthwhile thought or not. In fact, most thoughts are wrong. And yet we have the idea that our thoughts are right. Oh, it's my idea. It must be a good idea. And we don't like it when somebody says, that's not a good idea. My idea is better. And so we don't like that kind of stuff. But when we come to understand that thoughts are merely a process based upon inadequate memory and faulty processing in the sense of perception, then we can recognize that our thoughts are not always going to be correct. So there's no reason to attach to it. It's not my thought, it's just a thought. And so we begin to loosen our identity so that we don't identify with our thoughts, we don't identify with the body, because the body is not you. We don't identify with these feelings, they just arise. And if we're wise to them, we can deal with them successfully. And if we're not wise to them, then there's going to be the creation of a self. So, this is the way to start with your meditation now. And in fact, this is a really good follow on for the talk that we had before, because in the talk before we laid out the mechanics of it, and how all of these various processes fit together. But now we're beginning to understand how to deal with it, how to look at this, how to recognize what is a feeling. Can you see the feeling before it becomes a desire? With the concept of let go, recognize anything that you think that you need to let go of, you're already clinging to. And so how did we get to that state? How did we get to the clinging that we need to let go of? Because we cling really fast. That happens really fast, within 3-5 seconds. I don't like something, therefore I want to get rid of it, therefore I'm taking action. So that's how it works. So I want you to go and practice this, and practice it in the sense of, can you figure out how this mind works? Because you've got the roadmap now. Let me give you this analogy. Imagine that you were a caver. Now, there have been cavers for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, modern cavers are still finding evidence of deep, deep, dark past where people are in these caves 40,000 years ago, etc., like that. Okay, so let's think about going into being a caver. 40,000 years ago, going into that cave was really dangerous. It was dark. They didn't have good tools. They didn't have anything. But modern science now, especially if that cave has been to before, we've got a map of the cave. We've got lights. We've got ropes. We've got equipment. We might even need some snorkeling gear. But we've got the equipment that we need to go into that cave. It's going to be a much more useful, wholesome, valuable experience than if we go into that cave without any equipment, without a map. We're in the dark. We're just feeling around, and it may take years and years to figure out what we can just look at if we've got the light. So this idea of the caver then is to go into the mind is exactly that same thing. To go into the mind without any tools is the way that most people do it. But with these tools of Paticca Samuppada, with these tools of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path, and especially this combination of the five aggregates, the structure of how the mind is put together and the functions that it creates, I give to you as a map for you to go into your own mind as a cave and examine it to see if you can find these things in there. What is perception? What is consciousness? What are these sankharas? How do they bring on feelings? How am I contacted? Am I contacted by the actual outside object, or am I contacted by my own internal realization of that object? So this is the way to look, is start to examine how the mind works, and you'll come to understand that, if I can begin to see the feelings, I will have a chance of managing them. And so this would be sort of halfway through the game. The halfway point would be to see feelings as they are. The rest of the game will go even quicker than that, down to perception, beyond perception, down to basic mere consciousness. That's when the flood is there, is beyond perception. You can even start to play with that. What is it like to be here now with just the here now without me perceiving the here now? In the sense of trying to make sense out of it, or in the sense of trying to understand it or internalize it or whatever. Just let it be a flood. But that will be later. You can get glimpses of that now, but full understanding of it will come at a later time. Your job in the beginning is to recognize feelings as feelings before they become anything else, to recognize contact as contact. When an idea hits you, recognize that idea just hit and it caused a feeling.
In the process of meditation, there isn't much like, disliking happening because you're sort of calm and settled. I can see how you can investigate these things during the day, but
Yes,
you actually
absolutely.
sit.
At any time. See, the whole point of meditation is to get the mind calm so it can see this stuff. So the if you can think of it like that, is that that's in fact why it's called practice. But there's going to be a performance of your life that once you get the mind that's sharp, then you can see this. I mean, an example would be that you're sitting in meditation and a noise goes off. How do you react? How do you respond to that noise that goes off? Depends upon what the noise is, but recognizing what the noise is takes perception. So if it's a dog bark, it's different than a door slam. But in fact, you may jump with both of them. So, but the whole point of being in meditation is to be in seclusion, to be away from stimulus, which means then that most likely the kind of stimulus that you're going to have to deal with will be your own internal hindrances that arise. So when you're not calm and a hindrance arises, that hindrance is a kind of consciousness. That there are, in fact, 6 sense bases, not 5. The sixth one being the mind, and the mind will just generate something. Okay? Then we perceive it, then we have a feeling about it, or it contacts us. And so, even sitting in meditation, you will have the opportunity to do this. But let us say that you're really successful at getting the mind very, very calm while you're sitting in meditation. That's excellent. Now we want to begin to have that skill as we get off the cushion and go into the outside world. Because let's face it, you and I both know that you're not going to be sitting in meditation 16 hours a day for the rest of your life. You're just not going to do that. That's not what meditation is about. Meditation is a mental training so that we can live our lives out in the world. But in order to get this training, we have to remove ourselves from the world to begin to operate. It's almost like this. Think about it like this. If the car has an engine problem, but it's not severe enough that it stops the car from moving. So here we are tooling down the road with an engine that needs repair. While we're tooling down the road with an engine that needs repair, we can't repair it. We have to stop the car, turn the engine off, let it cool down, and now we can repair it. And after it gets repaired, then we can get back on the road to go. So that was one of the ways of thinking about meditation, is that we need to stop our lives long enough to sit down, cool off, and figure out what the problem is. And then we can get back on the road again. So we're not going to keep the car in the garage, and hopefully we're not going to let the car just continue to tool down the road with mechanical difficulties. We're going to stop it, and we're going to fix it. But how we know that the car's got mechanical difficulties is because we're out driving it. So we can hear that stuff. All right, that's what we need to pay attention to. So basically what we're saying is that you can have an event that happens in the outside world that maybe you didn't handle as well as you wanted to. So later on that same day, not a year later, but on that same day, you can come and you can reflect upon that. And you can recognize, oh, this is what happened in my mind, and I would prefer to have this happen in the mind, to take that path rather than this one. So this is the way that you want to do it. So next time you're out on the road and you hear that particular noise, you know exactly what to do. So it's a matter of going back and forth between the practice and what I would call here performance. Practice is on the couch or on the sitting cushion. Performance is how we live our lives based upon the practice. But there will come a time, like I was talking about with the infant, that will repel. The infant doesn't know anything about a cold, doesn't know anything about hot, but it will repel. If the infant has his hand touch that coal, the infant will withdraw immediately. All right, that's the third stage, and this is the third stage that I would call lila or playfulness. That our mind is so attuned that when we see dukkha, we repel from it. It's not a matter of struggling to get the thing repaired. It's not an effort anymore. So right effort eventually becomes right energy. What used to be a struggle now becomes effortless. Another example is an old fan that's run out of oil and you turn it on and it'll barely spin and it gets all hot and everything. But you put some oil on it and now it'll start to spin up. So that's the same thing. Is that we need to do that repair in this method so that once we have those repairs and everything is oiled up, it will spin properly. Everything will go along. Everything is copacetic. We have an easy life because we're watching what's going on. We're no longer ignorant. So the Paticca Samuppada, as I've taught it, is basically nothing but a verbal description of a mental map. But the map is not the territory. The way that I've described it is not exactly the way your mind operates. But it's enough of a map for you to begin to use that map to figure out exactly how your mind does operate. That in fact it would be far too complicated. It would take far too many words to adequately describe the way that the mind does work. In that regard, it's very much like the Tao. Have you ever heard of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching? Okay. The Tao or the Dhamma that can be spoken is not the Dhamma. The Paticca Samuppada that is really the way your mind works is not the Paticca Samuppada that can be spoken. So if you find discrepancies and the difference between the language that I have used and the way that you see your own mind work, take your own mind's working and your understanding of that as your example rather than the way that I'm describing it. Because I'm only trying to give you a map of how you of how your own mind works so that you can begin to take control of it at these two primary points. The first one is at the point of contact with feelings arising, and then eventually at the point of contact with perception, with consciousness before perception arises. But that's kind of advanced. You can become happy and wholesome and a marvelous human being without ever getting down to that point. But you also, by being able to do it at that midpoint, you will have experiences of it at that earlier point too. Just sitting and just be here now just invites you into that state of just merely allowing things to come in without taking any object at all, without perceiving anything, without naming anything, just enjoying the moment. And so both of these are available to you, but the important one is to know how you feel at the point when the feeling arises. If you can do that, then the self will not manifest itself in the form of suffering. You can say, I don't like it, but it's merely, oh, I don't like it, and I know I don't like it. I don't have to hate it. I don't have to destroy it. I don't have to feel bad about it. I can just recognize it. I don't like it. And by recognizing that, now we can actually use the frontal cortex with our wisdom to figure out what to do about it. The example that I have with my daughter would be that I can tease her. I can be joyful with her. I do not have to give her the same model back that she's giving me. Depending on what she's angry at. In fact, if it's mom that she's angry at, then I'll do something like, well, come here, kitty, I'll take care of you. But you can see how we get angry at kids when they throw a tantrum. Nobody wants to be around a kid throwing a tantrum. If a kid's in the grocery store throwing a tantrum, mom wants to leave. She wants to get out of there.
I don't remember this, but my mom recently told me a story where I threw a tantrum because I wanted a toy that I already had, but a slightly different version. So it was in a toy store, and she took me outside. She went inside this building, and she said she hit me. And I don't remember any of this, but I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, you probably traumatized me. Oh, and she said after that, you completely changed. You would never throw tantrums, and you would be very obedient. And she said, I never had to check your homework at school. But I was, very small at that point. Kind of a shocking story for me. Because you would expect your mom to kind of be wiser, but yeah.
Well, if what you're telling me is correct, perhaps she did the right thing. Sometimes wisdom says we got to take action here.
Right.
In fact, this is an old argument around psychologists, to where the psychologists have how to say it, they have planned in advance, so when they have children, that they have the intention or the attitude that they'll never spank the kids. That's exactly the way that I have operated with Kitty. She has never been hit, not struck, not even once. But sometimes I think, is that exactly the right way to do it? Maybe this kid needs to get hit a couple of times.
But I think it probably caused me to be terrified of my mom, so that was kind of, do you want a relationship like that with your child?
Exactly.
Child is
Exactly.
terrified, yeah.
Exactly. And so, in this regard, we're not really thinking about the relation, the understanding of the child, but more of mom. How does mom come out of her bad feelings that she does not have to have a tantrum because the kid is having a tantrum?
Right.
The answer is, why does she have a tantrum? Well, it's because she wasn't watching how she was feeling. And so she let her feelings run away with her. If she had just recognized, oh, I don't like this kid saying this, then perhaps the right thing to do is to just take the kid home, pick him up out of the grocery cart or whatever, and leave the grocery cart with all the groceries right there, and take the kid home. That's an extreme, because now we're not doing any of our shopping, but at least it got us out of the situation. So there's many, many different possibilities. Um, one of the possibilities in that regard is let the child have the toy while they're in the store, and tell them that, and say, okay, you can have this toy while we're still in the store, but when we go home, we're going to go put this toy back on the shelf. Is that okay? And so making these deals with them.
Yeah.
Go to bed now doesn't work. But okay, in 5 minutes, you got to go to bed. And then 5 minutes later, they go to bed, no problem. But if you try to push it in the beginning, you're going to get a huge amount of resistance. But if you give them a kind of an advanced warning, then everything works well. I found that really works very well with Kitty. She will never do what you tell her to do. But if you give her warning, then the second time, then she'll go for it. And the thing that I find so amazing is that I know exactly what this is, and I'm surprised that she hasn't figured it out. That I'm using a psychological trick on her.
You wait a little bit. In a couple
Mm-hmm.
of years, she will.
Oh, she'll figure it out, huh?
Yeah.
I guess then I'll have to say, okay, 3 times then. Yes, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to that. So I hope that this is an answer to the question of that you're asking of who am I? Because that question is not appropriate because the only way to answer it is way too late in the game. You have to have a self in order to define who am I. And it's almost always I suffer, I hurt. That's almost always where it winds up. So that's not an appropriate way of looking at the situation. The appropriate way of looking at it is through the lens of the Four Noble Truths, through the lens of where's the suffering? How does the suffering get created? What's the source of the suffering? And we recognize the source of the suffering is ignorant feelings. When there is delusion about how we feel, then we're going to feel worse and worse. But if we're capable of seeing things as they really are, right when that feeling arises, because we know where that feeling comes from, we know the contact, we know what it was that caused the feelings to arise. We can see that. Now we have a choice about it. But this requires also a mind that's very sharp, very fast, very quick. And so we need to have that practice of not having the mind just wandering away, but having it on guard.
Sometimes you don't even know why the feeling arose. Like, like stuff like boredom, it kind of creeps in on you, and you're sitting there miserable, and you're like, yeah, I don't like this. But there's nothing really that caused it. No.
We'll talk about that later. That's actually at the level, that's a high fetter. We need to learn to deal with feelings first, and then we'll learn to deal with the kinds of feelings like boredom and restlessness that occur seemingly without cause. There is a cause, but it's very deep.
It's probably a whole collection of causes, too.
Yes. In fact, the Buddha has a list of 5, and we'll talk about them eventually.
Okay.
But they're very, very deep seated, and they're difficult to see. To where these feelings are also difficult to see, but we're giving you the tools to be able to see that now. That the tools are that sharp mind and the understanding that feelings arise, and if they arise ignorantly, they'll wind up in suffering. But if they're wise feelings in the sense that we can see that feeling, then we can choose how we're going to behave. Now, eventually what happens is that those feelings, because we keep modifying them over and over again, we begin to take control over them, then that means that we're kind of uncovering some of these deeper issues. One of the deepest issues of all is going back to the concept of the organism preservation instinct, means that we have to start eventually dealing with our fear of death, because we're going to die. And so the fear of death is actually underlying many of the problems that we have. We feel insecure, and the insecurity comes from the possibility of death. but we can make some changes to that. I don't want to go into great detail about that with you right now because we've got, let us say, a more immediate issue to deal with. But eventually we will deal with um, attachment to life, conceit, mana, restlessness, remorse, um, uh, higher ignorances. And when I say by higher ignorance, I mean the ignorance of the things that we don't know that we're ignorant about. An example of that is that somebody goes and he takes a math class, and in the middle of the class, the teacher is saying something, and then the student asks a question. The student asks a question about the information that was in the class. If he had not taken that class, he wouldn't even have had a concept of what question there was to ask. This is also true with the mind, that once we get to a certain point, we begin to see things completely differently. So that's when we begin to uncover a deeper level of ignorance that we didn't even know was there. And so deep ignorance, restlessness, remorse, boredom is the second one, conceit, which basically means comparing ourselves to other people, as well as this twin issue of life and death. So these are the very deep issues that we'll have to uncover in time, because uh, there'll come a time when you recognize that the way you're dealing with someone is not because you're angry at them. There's no anger there, but you still think you're better than they are. You still have conceit. We still think that I'm a good person and they're not a good person, even though there's no anger, no ill will. I'm very happy with my friend. He's a good friend of mine, but I still have the opinion that I'm better than he is.
Wow. Sounds like challenging stuff. But
Yeah, so
as for boredom, I'm finding I'm getting pretty good at working with it. I found what works for me is increasing mindfulness helps
exactly.
with boredom, and almost all the time that works.
Okay. Now, boredom has two levels, just like consciousness does, except that boredom has the two levels. One is a deep, deep seated unsatisfactoriness. And then the other kind of boredom is the kind that we actually experience in the form of hindrances. When we get bored and we know that we're bored, that's the level that you need to deal with. That when you get bored and you know that you're bored, you know how to get out of it. Never mind, take a deep breath, throw those thoughts of boredom out, and recognize or see or give yourself good thoughts about this is really nice. Or the thought of, wow, I really feel like a champion when I can catch that boredom and throw it away. Okay, so these are the kind of thoughts that you want to substitute for those thoughts and feelings of boredom. That you're not a victim anymore. In fact, you never were a victim. You've been playing the role of victim inadequately. You get low marks for being a victim because you're not a victim. You're a champion, but you've been confused. Okay, so boredom is the expression of the victim, and the champion is the position of, aha, I can see that stuff, and I can deal with it successfully. So everything around, let us say, a major quality of the way the Four Noble Truths work has to do with these twin issues of right view and right attitude. With right view comes right attitude. The wrong attitude is the attitude of the victim. Oh, I'm bored. Oh, mommy, give me something to do. But the right noble attitude is, aha, I can see that boredom. Aha, I've caught you. And so at that level, it's still just a hindrance. Never mind, start again.
Yeah.
And the more successful you get at dealing with the hindrances and the clearer your mind gets, then the more likely it is that you can see the underlying restlessness that is there, the basic dissatisfaction.
I have that.
Well, it comes from the point of physics. It comes because life itself is delicate. Life itself is temporary. The very basic organisms that were developing, let us say, 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, for sure, they're all dead. They struggled and they died. Your life is kind of a struggle. And so we have a basic restlessness, a basic deep dissatisfaction with life because it is temporary. And that we need to learn to deal with that boredom the way that a champion would rather than the way that a victim would. Just a change of attitude about it. You're not going to get rid of the boredom. You're going to be able to. Let me use this example. This is a joke from my dad. My dad told a few jokes from time to time. He said, "Work. I'm not afraid of work. I can lay down beside it and take a nap." So for you, boredom. I'm not afraid of boredom. I can play with it. Now that's very interesting. Work, I'm not afraid of work. I can lay down beside it and take a nap. That's just a change of phrase, but it's the whole way of looking at it, all right? You don't have to struggle with the work. That in fact, that's the whole quality of right effort. We have to do a little bit of a struggle in the beginning because we don't have any other choice. We don't know how to do it with energy. But as you grow, as you change, once you begin to see what the nature of suffering really is, it becomes repulsive to you. And when it becomes repulsive, now it's really easy to deal with. And so when you begin to see that boredom, you can become repelled from it in the sense of, yeah, that's not me. But the way that you have been dealing with it is boredom. Oh, poor me.
Well, even as when one is not mindful, you just stuff yourself with stimuli, so you never in that position to even experience boredom. And I'm finding I'm dealing much better with that, where I just have this urge to just simplify things, have less activities, less stimuli coming at me, and just, I don't know, make lunch and not at the same time listen to a podcast, at the same time listen to music. I just want to do one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm. Simplifying the life, exactly. That's good. Now, one of the things that you're pointing at, I've seen, in fact, it's very, very characteristic of a 10-day retreat. One of the qualities of the students going, whether it's a Mahasi, or it's a Metta, or it's a Goenka, or it is at Swan Mok, or Jack Cornfield, all of them will have the basic rules of no talking, no reading, no cell phones or laptops or whatever like that, which is basically saying that the student is the biggest problem with the retreat is time structuring for the student, because all the ways that he's been structuring time to get rid of the boredom, etc., is now being removed in the retreat, so that the student can begin to take a look at what his actual own mind is, because we've got very little else to look at other than one's own mind. And so this is almost a guarantee that students are going to have to deal with boredom in those retreats. And that boredom will manifest itself in many ways. One of the ways that it will do is coming up as anxiety. In other words, the restlessness part of boredom gets so strong that they're just agitated, fully agitated. Why? Well, they were already prone to do that, but they were keeping it away by keeping the mind occupied. Just like a mom, when the kids are bored, she'll give them a book to read or a toy to play with or whatever. So we spend our whole lives looking for books or toys to play with to prevent us from having to look at this deep underlying dissatisfaction that we carry around that keeps bubbling up. But the new way of doing it is let's remove that stuff, and then when this stuff does bubble up, we can catch it right when it bubbles up and not give it any truck. Don't give it any effort. Don't spend any time with the boredom other than recognizing, aha, that's boredom, and I'm a lion. And I do not have to submit myself to becoming the victim of my own boredom. So that in that regard, the hindrance of restlessness and boredom and the underlying fetter of restlessness and boredom are the same thing, but they manifest themselves differently. And so the more able you are to deal with them as a hindrance, then the more the rotting away it will happen as a deep underlying fetter. It will begin to rot away because you're not giving it any energy at all. Another way of thinking about it is in the neural pathways of the mind, the boredom has already cut its own mental pathway, its own rut-filled, muddy road. But now what we're going to do is we're going to see that road and we're going to avoid it at all cost and take always a different road. Maybe parallel, maybe right beside it, but we're not going to get stuck in those ruts. And eventually, the grass is going to grow, the rain is going to fall, and these ruts are going to actually disappear. The same thing is true if you can deal with boredom and restlessness at the point of it being a hindrance as it arises in the mind, and deal with it successfully every time it comes up, then that underlying tendency will begin to rot away. Another way of saying it is that if you let a field go fallow, let us say for 7 years, it's going to have a lot of seed for weeds. But every year you come and you plant and you weed the garden. Eventually, after 7 or 8 years now, there's very little weeds left because we've been pulling up the seeds of them all along. So this is another way of looking at it, is that over time, by dealing with it correctly at the time when it arrives, eventually the source of that stuff will become less and less powerful. So looking at it from the perspective of weeds, looking from it from the perspective of neural pathways, looking at it from the perspective of a path full of ruts, we can recognize that, that's also true then, that if I do not allow the boredom to have any weight, then the sources of it will eventually rot away and die. But if I give the boredom power, and one of the ways of giving it power is by the thought, I'm bored. But giving it no power is, aha, I see you. Aha, I see you. And in fact, that aha, I see you is not a state of boredom. You just got yourself out of it. Now you're in a state of champion. Now you're in a state of successfulness. Ah, I'm successful. I can see that boredom. Basically, the boredom then, or the hindrance of boredom, is only effective and only is growing when we don't know it's there. Once you can see it, you're already halfway there. So congratulate yourself that you're already dealing with boredom because you can see it. A lot of people, they can't see it. They suffer from it, but they can't see it. Now that you can see it, you can be on guard for it. So that when it does arise, you can say, aha, I see you.
Yeah.
Now, in that regard, it's always the same thing. What I mean by always the same thing, the hindrances are always the same. So if it's greed and we see it, we can say, aha, I see you. And then the greed will melt. If it's boredom that arises, we can say, aha, I can see you. In all cases, we're changing it from being a victim into being a champion, into being the victim of it. Oh, this is so bad, or oh, I don't feel so good, into, aha, I can see that I don't feel bad and I don't have to. I can see that stuff. And I can take a deep breath and feel successful at having seen it. And by seeing it, I get out of it. So I've told you the same thing now 20 different ways. I don't know how. But that's the map. That's the way that the mind works. Start watching for how things contact you and the feelings that arise, including the feeling of boredom, because it's just a feeling. It's just a mental hindrance. And by seeing it, you can change it. By the very basic techniques that we've always given. Take a deep breath, put a smile on, become that champion. Aha, I can see that. Aha, I can see it. I caught you. That's the most important quality. Because a lot of the students, when they practice meditation, they can see the boredom, but they don't take control of it. They don't say, aha, I can see you. They will just stay stuck in the boredom.
For some reason, I don't get bored in meditation, but I'm talking about like a slow day at work, or sometimes even, on weekends when the day is not structured, you kind of just tend to be lazy and distracted. I think it's because you're kind of, bored. There is not much to.
Right. So that's something that you can really begin to look at is that you have lived, and New Yorkers are good at this. You've lived a life that's been so structured that when you have no structure, then this basic underlying boredom comes up. And that's exactly what happens with students in their first retreat. You take all their books and all their toys and all their gossip away, and they have to start dealing with this stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're doing. You're setting it up so that you can uh, um, deal only with your own mind. And now when that stuff comes up, you can say, aha, there it is. I got it. I can see it. You can take a deep breath and you can say, and I don't have to feel that way, even though I have been in the habit of feeling that way. You can choose how you feel. That's remarkable because your entire society that you lived in are telling you you cannot control the way you feel. You have to buy our product in order to feel good. You have to do what we tell you to do, and then you can feel good. If you don't do what we tell you, you can't feel good. You've got to stay there miserable and bored. And the Buddha is saying, oh no. In fact, most of the problem that you're having is because you've been doing what you were told to do by people who didn't know what was the right way to do things. So now we're getting a new way of looking. The new way of looking at it is to let that boredom have its opportunity to arise, and you're right there like it was you're playing whack-a-mole, and as soon as it does, bang, you got it.
I'll try that.
So now that you know that, when you have days that are slow at work, you can say, "Oh, boredom 5 minutes away. Let's be work. Let's wait. Let's watch. Let's see there. Let's be ready for it. It's going to come, and when it does, I'm going to whack it."
The 3 o'clock boredom, the 3 p.m.
Good. So now you know exactly what to do about that. It comes up as a hindrance, but there is an underlying seed of it, and that the more you deal with it when it comes up, then over time it will be more and more easy to deal with. Because every time that you interrupt it, you're actually cutting a little of its power.
Sounds good.
Okay, so now you've got a slightly different perspective on the way that you're going to practice.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, excellent. This teaching of Paticca Samuppada is a profound teaching. And that the more that you get involved with seeing how the mind works, you'll have one insight after another, insight after another, after another. This is what Vipassana is all about, is beginning to understand the nature of the mind and how it works. And so this little discussion that I've given you over the past 2 lectures is only a map. It's not the real territory. The real territory you're going to have to deal with, but you can do that successfully with these maps that I've been giving you. They didn't come from me, by the way. They come from the Buddha, not mine.
Oh yeah, and I'm having more and more of the, how you call them, the little nibbana moments. I love
Yes.
them a lot, and it's wonderful.
Excellent. Keep up with that. Yes, that's the third noble truth. Begin to understand what it's like to be free from suffering. To have little Dhammarato moment. Ah, this is so nice.
Yeah, it's great when it's, for no reason, really. You're just happy and in the moment.
Well, actually, if you can think of reasons in the sense of the negative, is the joy or the nibbana will come. That's why by the way, this is one of the things about Buddhist philosophy where people get really confused about. Because nibbana is considered, um, how to say it, unconditioned. Well, what we're really looking at is that the boredom itself is conditioned. But nibbana, or the coolness, is like the conditioning is the mental process that gives us suffering, gives us fire, gives us pain, gives us suffering, and whatnot like that. And when we take that away, even for a moment, then we remove the conditioning. And so the nibbana moment is the coolness that we experience from having none of these conditions that cause the fire. That's why we call it unconditioned. And a really easy way of looking at that is imagine having a pie in the oven and you're cooking the pie. Could be a pizza pie or an apple pie. Don't matter what kind. So you take the pizza pie out of the oven. It's too hot to eat right now. You need to let it nibbana. So you take it out of the oven. The oven was the conditioning part. The oven conditioned a pizza from a raw piece of thing into cooked food ready to eat. But also it conditioned the food to be too hot. So now we have to uncondition, have to take the pie out of the oven to let it cool off, which means now there's no conditioning of that pizza. It's going to cool off, and now it's going to be really delicious to eat. So that's
Speaking,
why we call
yeah,
it unconditioned, and I wanted to make that point to you so that it's not confusing. Yeah, so when you are in a state to where you're not burning your mind, then you're naturally going to fall into nibbana.
yeah, it happens often. I'm glad.
You sound British. That is so understatement.
No, it's really nice. But speaking of food, can I ask you a controversial question? Um,
Okay.
what's your opinion on, vegetarianism or veganism and Buddhism? Do they?
Oh, let me see if I can give you a very, very quick answer. There has also been a movement of vegetarianism in Thailand, and that the proponents of the vegetarianism ask Achan Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, are you a vegetarian? And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's answer to that question was, I eat food. All right. So the Buddha, by the way, was also not vegetarian. That vegetarianism actually, if there's any one particular source, we could chase it back to the Jains, the Jain religion, which is part of Hinduism now, but it originally was much more of a competitor. Um, but it does fit in with the Buddhist concept of abhimsa, which means harmlessness. Um, the Buddha had it. Here's a story. This story, I think, is a story of Tanisaro, to where one of the students who came to him said, the next time I'm coming back, I'm going to bring you a roast turkey. And Tanisaro said, that sounds good. That's okay. And the guy says, I'm a turkey farmer and I've got one picked out. And Tanisaro says, I'm sorry, but I cannot accept that turkey, but any other will do. Now, what that means is that the Buddha says that the monks are not supposed to eat meat that was specifically prepared for the monk. That what the monks eat is general food that's eaten by the general population, and that we eat what we are served by the people. That we learn to eat what we're given, and be grateful for that. Not that I'm making any references back to the Ethiopian restaurant or anything, but the point that we're making here is that I'll tell you another story. This one happened at Abaya, Gary, in northern uh, California when I was there. I was in the kitchen, we were having a discussion, and a young Thai man came storming into the kitchen, opening shelves. He was clearly angry, but he was speaking Thai at high speed, so I didn't have a clue about what he was saying. And two products he pulled out. One was a bottle of fish sauce, which had a fish on the label, and the other one was a box of Post Toasties, which had a picture of a chicken on the front of the box. Has no chicken in it, but you know what I'm talking about, I think. You've seen the box. It's got a picture of a chicken on it, but it's got nothing but cornflakes inside. So the guy was really angry. He was talking about this. There was a couple of Thai people there, and he finally storms out, gets in his car, and speeds away. And now we're left with the conversation. What had happened was is he had brought a whole bunch of stuff to the temple and was offering it to the monk to get the blessing the way that the Thai people do. But this monk at this particular monastery was a Westerner, and he hadn't been there long. Probably wasn't a monk very long, but he was a vegetarian. And he made the gross mistake of telling that to this young Thai man who was there trying to make a donation. In other words, he made a disaster because he was a vegetarian. So in this conversation with the folks in the room, one of the women said, "Well, we've got cats here. We could feed all the meat to the cats." This monk did not have to reject that food. So the problem is not the issue of vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism. The issue has to do with how do we treat one another. And the monks are designed to set it up when it works correctly so that we receive the gifts, the people get the benefit from the generosity because it's well received. And even if the monk does not eat that particular item, is not the issue. So the issue of vegetarianism winds up being not whether people eat meat or not. It has to do with, is this a political movement or not? That's when it becomes problematic, is when it's a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
When we try to, how to say that vegetarianism is better than eating meat. Now, I know all the arguments. In fact, I'll agree with almost all the arguments. Yeah, avatars are hellholes. Yes, the way that we do meat production in the United States is a tragedy. I also remember one of my actually she was a great aunt, and the story she told about at one time they had to kill their pet and eat it. This pet happened to be a pet pig, and the kids didn't want it. They didn't want to eat that pig because that was their pet. But mom, being more practical, she killed the pig and, and cooked it. But a lot of Westerners now, when we think of pets, we wouldn't dare eat our pets. But in China, people have dogs as pets this year, and next year he's dinner. So it has to do with a particular attitude. And I would say that that Chinese attitude of pet this year and dinner next is possibly the worst of it all. Because backing up into vegetarianism has to do with not causing any suffering. And yet, if we're eating our pet, now we're kind of wallowing in it. Because it's a yucky feeling to eat something that's been your friend, your pet, your loved one, etc., like that. So that's the beginning of vegetarianism, is to recognize it causes tremendous amount of suffering. But the Thai cuisine has meat in it, but it never has it the way that the West does, other than it becoming Western food as an import. For an example of that is, I don't know of anywhere in Thailand you can get a steak. Steaks don't exist. You don't eat meat for meat's sake. That is used as a flavoring. And so rice soup will have pork in it. But it's still rice and it's still a soup, not much pork in it. So that bowl of rice soup is not a bowl of pork. There's no more than maybe 2 or 3 spoonfuls of pork in that whole bowl of rice. So that's another way of looking at it, is not 100% dyed-in-the-wool vegetarian. In fact, there's even something going even further than that, where they don't eat any milk, they don't eat eggs. Well, eggs is a primary aspect of the Thai diet. We use a lot of eggs. But milk is not part. In fact, most of the Thai people are lactose intolerant. It's only in recent times that there's even been a milk industry in Thailand. In fact, you have to go to certain places like Tesco or 7-Eleven to even find it. You'll never find milk on the menu of a restaurant. Okay? So that's the thing. It's a very complicated issue. And it's complicated by one person having a view, I'm better than you are because of what I eat.
What about if a person, doesn't really judge others, but he has a feeling that, oh, maybe it does cause suffering, unnecessary suffering, so for myself, I would rather become vegetarian or vegan. Is that,
That's a
good?
really excellent, wonderful choice. And if you can make that choice and do it cleanly without suffering, then that's the best way to go. But often, like I was pointing out, that being a vegetarian doesn't necessarily eliminate suffering, and in fact, it can create suffering when we have the attitude that I'm better than somebody else, like that monk did. That monk, because he was a vegetarian, caused a huge problem. That young man may not, in fact, ever go back to that monastery again. He was furious that his offerings were refused like that. I hope that Achan Amaro or Pisano or one of the big dudes figures out that that happened and set that monk straight so it doesn't happen a second time. But that's the point that I'm making is that there is vegetarianism that can be useful, valuable, and wholesome, and then there is vegetarianism that is blamey, that is superior, etc., like that, that does cause a lot of suffering. So if you are a vegetarian, recognize and operate only from the possibility of it being useful, valuable, and wholesome in the sense of not causing suffering, not causing harm. That's the way of looking at it. But I call it the whole concept. I call it church lady, and the word church lady to me is is kind of an icon or an avatar or something like that. There's a handle that I can put on something that basically what the word church lady means is hypocrisy, or that we make rules for ourselves and then we make those same rules for others. And then the rule for the other becomes more important than the rule for the self. That's what hypocrisy is. And a very clear example of that in America is the issue of abortion. How dare you pass laws to prevent abortion? Now, here's the way of looking at it is that it's really okay for me to be a right to lifer. I really do hold the right to life. But I think that it's wrong for other people who have right to life views that they're superior enough that they can pass laws telling all kinds of other women that they've never known, they don't know the circumstances, etc., like that, that I know for you better than you do. Therefore, I'm going to make it illegal for you to have an abortion because I don't want to have one myself. You can see that that issue also winds its way into vegetarianism. And probably the worst of it all is when because there are a certain kind of monks that say, okay, not only no meat and no eggs, no fish, no milk, but also no onions and no garlic. Well, now we're beginning to really put trouble for the lay people who are trying to feed these monks. All the things that the lay people they eat themselves, they can't fix it, or they can't just give the food that they're making for themselves. They got to go out of their way to fix something special for the monks. And whoever made those silly rules anyway? It's because people are looking for perfection. So if we start at one end and say, well, the meat is because we don't want to kill animals, that it's a way of removing suffering. But hey, the chicken isn't complaining so much about the loss of an egg. The chicken will really complain about the loss of the chicken's life. But the loss of an egg, not a big deal. All right, so the same thing with the cow. The cow is not going to complain too much about the loss of the milk, but the loss of the cow, that's a big deal. And the same thing then with the onions. Well, we're not losing anything at all with onions and garlic. So why are we making rules about that? The answer is that we're taking abhimsa as an idea and turning it into an ideal. How good can we make our abhimsa? Right? Well, I don't even see where it comes from with onions and garlic. Now I do know that vampires don't like garlic. And onions have sugar in it, so if you're going to be on a low carbohydrate diet, onions should be removed. But other than the sugar of onions and the garlic of the vampire, I don't see any problem with those two things. And yet, every week I get an email about the events of that particular temple, and in there they'll say that we're having a potluck. Don't bring any food that has any of these things in it. And so I wrote back to the guy about that, and he says, well, that's what the monks say. And I said, well, don't put that in the article. Let people bring what they want to bring, and let the monks pick through what they want to eat and not want to eat. Don't put that in the email telling them in advance, because if you do that, you'll wind up having some people who won't even go to the temple on that particular night because they don't have the ability to give you what you say the monks want. So that's that whole story that I wanted to tell you. Probably taking a little bit too long with it. But the point is that vegetarianism, when done correctly, is a very valuable, hostful, and useful thing. But almost every way that I see it applied winds up adding suffering, probably adding more suffering than they take away, because they're making other humans suffer because those humans have different viewpoints. So your vegetarianism should be something that you want to practice by yourself. That's fine. No problem at all. But don't sell it. And especially don't sell it with the bad feelings of, oh, you should be a vegetarian. That it has to do with staying at that point of elimination of suffering, the abhimsa, the no, and that's a very noble way of looking at how we eat, is to avoid meat when it's easily avoided. If it's not easily avoided, then when you avoid it, you're causing suffering. So if you go to, let us say that you go to a dinner party and the food is there and that there is meat on the plate, it's best not to tell the host that you're a vegetarian. The best thing to do is to eat what you can eat and not eat what you can't eat. And then if there's a dog in the room, you can slip the dog what you don't want to eat. He'll eat it for you. And in that regard, there's no suffering. And that's the way that we want to always look at it, is the issue of suffering and no suffering, which has very little to do with vegetarianism. Only in the sense of the elimination of the suffering of those animals that I would have been eating. They don't die.
Right.
Does that help you with that?
Yeah,
that question?
I was curious what your opinion was. Thank you.
Yes. We have the ability to make our own choices, but we do not have permission to make other people behave according to the way we think things should be done.
Yeah.
And that's true with abortion, it's true with vegetarianism. In fact, it's almost true with every moral issue we can think of.
I really want my mom to quit smoking, but I think I'm giving up on that fight.
Let me know if you want to continue the fight or not, because I've got some sneaky psychological tools that you can use.
I've tried everything.
Have you tried hiding her cigarettes?
Oh, she lives in a different country, so she's an independent.
That's not fun. If you're not if you don't have full access to her, there is nothing that you can do. Anything you say to her is not going to work. It's only going to cause you and her suffering. If you lived in the same house with her, then there's some sneaky little things you can do. Like all of a sudden her cigarettes got wet. Oh, I don't know how they got wet, but they're not smokable when they're wet.
Yeah.
You gave her a gift. What was the gift? A teaspoon of water. But since she's in a different country, you have absolutely nothing to do with that other than to make yourself and perhaps her feel bad.
Right.
So don't bother.
Yeah. That's been, ever since I was born, I guess. So, unless she decides on her own, that that would be the only way.
Well, you can love her just as much whether she's a smoker or not. And
Right.
eventually you'll come to the position that you can love her even if she's killed herself with smoking.
Yeah.
So
Stuff.
whether she smokes or not is not your job, not your issue. It's hers. And that's really, really difficult for us to understand. Part of that is because we're victims and we want help, we assume that everybody's a victim that wants our help. Once you recognize that you are a victim only because it's your choice and it's your job to get out of it, we can also leave that for the students. That a teacher cannot teach the Dhamma, but students can learn it. So your mom, she'll do what she wants to do. Your job is to love her, to care for her.
Yeah. I stopped bugging her about it. It's like, just do what you want.
Someday, in fact, you might, in fact, want to go so far as to go out and buy a gift of the most expensive, fanciest cigarettes or tobacco product you can find
No
and send
way.
it to
No
her.
way. I'm not that advanced.
You're not that far along. But you see what I'm getting at.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Accept her for what she is. You'll get a whole lot because you can't change her, especially with the distance that you're at. You don't have the tools. The only tools that you can have are those that you can deal with her directly. You'd be surprised at how little effectiveness emails are. Emails are. If you don't already agree with what's in an email, no email is going to convince you of anything.
Yeah. It's very superficial.
Very superficial, right? So at that distance, you don't have any real tools that you can use. And recognizing that, you can take the pressure off of yourself because it's not your job to stop her from smoking. That's a hard one, isn't it?
It is because, it's also about, it causes me worry and anxiety, or it did before. Uh, so it's more of the taking care of myself, not having worry and anxiety.
Right. You don't work. Here's the thing, don't try to stop her from smoking cigarettes. Stop yourself from the worry and anxiety you have about mom smoking cigarettes.
Right.
That's your job.
Yeah.
And you can, and in fact, the next time that you're out shopping at one of those tobacconists or whatever, because New York has got them, you'll think about that. Oh, maybe someday I, in fact, will buy mom a very, very beautiful, fancy package of cigarettes to let her know I accept her.
We'll see.
Well, you've got the tools to see now.
Right.
You've got the tools to see. So go practice those tools. Go practice that seeing. See how the mind works. See that anxiety. Recognize it as it pops up. Because in that regard, it's going to pop up with the thought of mom smoking. With the thought of mom smoking, now here comes the anxiety and all of that, and that needs to be dealt with. That mom smokes or not is not your problem. Anxious, anxiety, not wanting it, fear for her death, all of that. That's what you can deal with.
Right. Yeah. I'll work on that.
Play with it instead. Remember my dad's joke. Work. I'm not afraid of work. I can lay down beside it.
Right.
Yeah, or I can play with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't work on it. Work has the expectations of future results. And what you're looking for is immediate results. Right now, I feel anxiety about my mom smoking. Right now, I can deal with that by saying, never mind, mom smoking is not my problem. My problem is anxiety. Let me deal with that instead. So that's the way of doing it. Work with what's happening in this particular moment, or better, play instead of work. Play with what's happening right now. Watch it, see it, notice it. Say, aha, I caught you, anxiety.
Yeah.
Aha, I can and in fact, you can see the relationship between anxiety and restlessness, and see the relationship between anxiety, restlessness, and boredom. Boredom and anxiety are very related. It's almost the same thing. It's just two different ways of looking at it. It would be even possible for you to say, I'm bored with mom smoking. So now that you recognize that the issue that you have with mom smoking is how you feel about it, not her actually smoking, now with that knowledge, you can do something about it.
Right. Definitely. Different
Okay.
way.
All right. Well, I think that we've come to a fairly good place to stop.
Yes. Thank you so much. The previous video, I sent it to you. Did you get it?
Yes, I got it.
Great. Mm-hmm.
It's either been posted yesterday late, or if not, I'll check because I've still got a couple of posts or videos that still need to be put onto
Yeah.
YouTube.
It's big, so it will probably,
Yeah,
give you a
many of
try.
these files are big. More than 2 hours of
Yeah.
video is a big file. All right, well, it'll be there. Thank you. But you've already got your own copy of it.
Yes. Yes. All of them. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I really enjoy our conversations.
Oh, me too. Me too. Not only enjoy, but I learned so much and invaluable skills.
It is. The Dhamma is so good. It really is. Marvelous stuff the Buddha came up with. I really love it. All right, Natalie, we'll see
Thank you.
you next time.
Yes.
Bye
Have a
bye.
great day. Bye bye.
Is it frozen?